Marianne, are you still there? Maybe not. Or let me ask Paulina something. Paulina, when I tweet, I can see you there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to.
I think we're starting in half a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to use Unep, the @Unep and the @Ilri. Is there anyone else I should be targeting? Do you think? If you do think, you could put
Inger
it in.
has one, but I don't know what it is.
Okay.
NRI, if you can add.
Thank you, Delia. I'll go find them. I looked up South African Medical Research Council. They don't have a Twitter account apparently, so I won't use them, but I will put in NRI. Thank you.
Susan, do you have my Twitter account? This is Susan Gardner.
Oh, no, but I'll look you up right now. Thank you very much.
Susan? It's SCM Gardner.
Okay.
I also tweeted the session, Susan, so you can see Doreen has an account as well. So Susan Gardner and Doreen are in that tweet. So if you look at my last tweet or one of my last two tweets.
Your private tweet or your Ilri tweet?
No, livestock.
Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon.
Start now.
All right, I think
Thanks.
we can start, right? All right, hello everyone. A warm welcome to our session, Building Back Better, taking a One Health approach for healthy landscapes, people, animals, and wildlife. This is a joint event hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme UNEP and the International Livestock Research Institute Ilri. My name is Pauliina Upla. I'm an environmental economist working with UNEP's Wildlife Unit and the Great Ape Survival Partnership here in Nairobi. And I will be facilitating the first half of this session. But before we get started, we would like to make sure that this event is as interactive as possible since we are fully online this time. So you can communicate through the Whova chat box and also participate in Menti polls. So we will be using the Mentimeter to ask you some questions to engage our audience a bit. And so please download the app on your phone or go to menti.com. The Menti code is you need to insert is 608025. And we'll get back to this in a few minutes. But now, just to introduce today's topic, we'll be talking about, we're talking about the One Health approach to mitigate zoonosis. And by zoonosis, we mean diseases and infections that are naturally transmissible from animals to humans. And just to start with some interesting figures, about 60% of known infectious diseases in humans and 75% of all emerging infectious diseases are in fact zoonotic. Already in 2016, it was estimated that the future costs of disease pandemics could be in the same order as those of climate change. As the science around the current pandemic that we're experiencing right now has mainly focused on the human side of zoonosis, very little has actually been studied on the environmental linkages, as well as the risk of any future outbreaks. So the experts that we have here today are working to better understand where these zoonoses, first of all, where do they come from? And how can we avoid the next one? And what they are proposing is to collaborate through a One Health approach, which basically unites expertise in human, animal, and environment health. At the organizational level, UNEP and Ilri are currently in the process of developing a memorandum of understanding to better study these specific linkages between livestock, wildlife, and environment. And because both of these organizations are also based here in Nairobi, we are working closely with the Ministry of Health in Kenya around the One Health approach. So I would like to thank our esteemed policy expert for joining this session today. We have Dr. Hadley Matendechero Sultani from the Ministry of Health in Kenya. We have Susan Gardner from UNEP and Ian Wright from Ilri. And also a big thank you to our expert panelists, some of whom are the lead authors of the upcoming rapid assessment on preventing zoonotic disease, which will be launched on the 6th of July on the World Zoonosis Day. And the aim of this session particularly is to try to increase our understanding of where the current pandemic came from, why it appeared and spread, and how the One Health approach can help respond and prevent new epidemics and pandemics from emerging. And you should be seeing the agenda on your screen. So you can see that this session has basically been broken into two parts. We will start with a series of expert statements on different aspects of zoonosis, and then we move on to the policy discussion, looking at how the One Health approach could be implemented at different levels. All right, but before we get started with our experts, now let's get back to Menti. I hope everyone has access now and has had time to upload the app or download the app. And the code, let me repeat the code, it's 608025. And our first question is, where are people viewing from? Where are you based right now, watching or listening to this event? And we're already getting some answers. We have the Philippines, Melbourne, UK, Germany, Kenya. Nairobi stands out pretty strongly. United Kingdom, many European countries are dominating at the moment, but hopefully we get a bit more geographic variance as well. Brazil, I can see Brazil, Taiwan, Singapore, Burkina Faso, India, Colombia, Indonesia. Okay, that's great. It's great to hear that there are people watching this event from all over the world, because this is a very global and international topic, and it's a very important topic for all of us. Germany and the Philippines are, I think, the most popular countries at the moment. Should we maybe move on to the next question? So the next question is, aside of COVID-19, which we're all now familiar with, can you name any other disease that can spread between humans and animals? So in other words, another zoonotic disease you are aware of? There might be some diseases that we may not directly associate as being zoonotic, but they do exist. Okay, so here we have a lot of them already. We have SARS, we have rabies, parrot fever, COVID-19, HIV/AIDS, bird flu, flu a few times, swine flu. Yeah. It appears our audience is very well informed. Ebola. Anything else coming up? But I think this is already a good collection. Malaria. Okay, and again, rabies and SARS. All right, well, anyway, this goes to show that our audience knows what we're talking about. So let's move on in the program then. So at this point of time, can I ask all our expert panelists to turn on their cameras so we can see you? While we are turning on the cameras, I can explain that the purpose of this session is to give a bit more background and framing around the current crisis that we're having with COVID-19, and what does it mean for agriculture and biodiversity. And also an important note, again, to the audience, you can send any questions to our experts through the Huva chat box, and we will pick a few after first hearing from all our experts. I can only see Doreen, but I assume people are already ready. So our first speaker today is Delia Grace, who will be talking more about the linkages between zoonosis and agriculture and livestock production. So Delia is a veterinary epidemiologist and the leading world expert on food safety issues in developing countries. She currently leads research on zoonoses and foodborne diseases at Ilri and is a professor of food safety systems at the Natural Resources Institute in the UK. Delia, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to this session. I think everybody here knows about COVID-19. It is a new disease, but pandemics are not new. In fact, people who study the risks faced by humanity consider that pandemics are among the most important risks, along with things like nuclear war or climate change. And indeed, historically, human pandemics have destroyed or altered civilizations. Examples are Black Death in Europe and the diseases carried from Europe to the New World by explorers and conquerors, which killed up to 95% of local populations. So where do these diseases come from? Most new human diseases come from animals, and especially from wildlife. However, domestic animals play an important role, not only as sources, but also as amplifiers and bridges between wildlife and people. In fact, we may think of these novel diseases as coming from a deadly intersection between three sectors: human health, animal health, and the environment. My colleague is going to talk more about some of the environment and wild animal issues. So for the rest of my short session, I would like to concentrate on domestic animals. Well, domestic animals are important, if nothing else, because we humans are so numerous and we have altered our environment to such an extent, and that has included keeping animals for food, companionship, and other tasks. In fact, it's estimated that of the biomass, the weight of living things on the planet Earth, wild animals are just 4%, humans are 36%, and the animals we keep and eat make up 60% of the world's biomass. And many of these animals are kept in what's called intensive systems, because in order to have many more animals than people to produce the food which people demand, the systems which allow this to be done most easily are what we call intensive systems, which often involve keeping large numbers of animals closely confined. Now, this is good for high production, but it's also good for growing diseases and for allowing diseases to spread. And also, in many of these systems, animals have been bred for decades for production and for being able to live closely together, and they're often genetically very similar. So this kind of closely packed, huge communities of genetic clones make ideal medium for rapid spread and mutation of diseases. And in recent decades, we've seen many of these production systems start to shift to developing countries, low and middle income countries, which is where most of the demand for animal source food is now increasing. Unfortunately, many of these countries have not been able to fully manage the biosecurity, that is all of the health, the hygiene, the separation required to keep intensively farmed animals healthy, and especially to keep them out of contact with wildlife. And again, many of these animals are being sold and marketed in ways which are not conducive to health or hygiene. The workers in these systems, be they in meat packing plants or abattoirs, are often stressed, low paid, and have little access to healthcare. All of these coming together mean that domestic agriculture, intensive agriculture, is part of the problem of pandemics and one of the solutions as well. And we will talk more about that when it comes to One Health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delia. As you explained, the domestic animals are really an important component of this overall zoonosis equation. And next, I would like to invite Johannes Refisch to talk more about the environmental linkages. So Johannes leads the Secretariat of the Great Ape Survival Partnership, hosted at the Unep headquarters here in Nairobi. He's an ecologist with an extensive scientific background, and he did his PhD on primates in the Thai National Park in Cote d'Ivoire. Johannes has worked with several conservation NGOs and international organizations, and he also holds an honorary senior research fellowship at the Center of Excellence for Environmental Decisions at the University of Queensland in Australia. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paulina. So the relationship between the environment and the emergent spread of zoonotic disease is very complex. So over the last century, we have changed our environment tremendously. A combination of human population growth, associated altering land for settlements, for agriculture, logging, extractive industries, linear infrastructure, or other uses has led to habitat and biodiversity loss. And this has created many opportunities for pathogens to pass between animals and humans, as the natural buffers have disappeared that would normally separate us humans from animals. But also changes in temperature, humidity, seasonality directly affect the survival of microbes in the environment. And evidence suggests that we might see more epidemics in the near future as the climate continues to change. Many developing countries, economic growth, rural to urban migration has led to a massive demand for dairy and meat products in the cities. So this has led to the expansion of cropland and more intense livestock farming near and around cities, thus increasing opportunities for exposure. So livestock often serves as an epidemiological bridge between wildlife and humans. And proximity to different species through traditional markets, for example, but also the consumption of wild meat also facilitates the transmission of disease between animals or from animals to humans. Early cases of SARS were associated with the contact to caged civet cats being sold in traditional markets. Another example is Ebola. Original Ebola was documented in very remote forest communities in Central Africa, with decimations in the local human population, very isolated events. But more recently, Ebola was documented in Eastern DR Congo, Uganda, Guinea, in transitional forest, leading to many more fatalities. In case of Ebola, we know that food beds are the vectors for that disease. But despite years and years of research, we still have insufficient evidence that food beds also are the reservoir. That's different for SARS-CoV-2. Here, in this case, with our new challenge, obviously, beds are the reservoir, but we haven't fully understood the exact transmission pathways to humans. So this all means much more research is needed. And specifically, we have to look into monitoring of wildlife health in intact ecosystems so that we can establish baselines. But also, we should be monitoring human and wildlife health at different stages of development so that we better understand the complex relationships between habitat alteration, conversion, and the emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases. So please let me stop here and back to you, Paulina.
Thank you so much, Johannes. It's very interesting. And indeed, this nexus between the diseases and the environment is a very diverse space, and there's a lot we still don't know about it. Let me now turn to Bernard Bett, who is our specialist on the One Health approach, and he will be talking about more about this particular approach. Bernard is the leading Kenyan veterinary epidemiologist at Ilri, where he's co-leading research on emerging infectious diseases. He's leading Ilri's One Health strategy and the development of the One Health Research, Education and Outreach Center for Africa. He has also led earlier work to better control the Rift Valley fever, which is a lethal zoonotic disease found in the Horn of Africa. So Bernard, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a good opportunity for us to discuss more about One Health. And I would really, first of all, describe what One Health is all about. Of course, the previous speakers have already mentioned about various diseases in which jump from wildlife to livestock to humans. And all this actually show that, the health of environment, health of animals, and health of humans are interrelated. And we need all the players, all the professionals working in those disciplines to work together to identify, first of all, what are the drivers for these diseases, and secondly, how they can be managed. So it's when you have one health approach, that means you have these various professionals or communities working together. It increases efficiency of surveillance. It also increases efficiency of control. This is because you can actually manage to contain the disease within the animal population before they jump into humans, if the surveillance data can be shared between the various people working together. So we have several examples in which One Health, or where One Health has been used before. So this, usually we have so much research which is being done now to use One Health approach. In that research, people working in environments can help identify drivers, things like climate change, things like extraction of vegetation, game meat, and many other things which expose people to infection. So that research is now being used to develop more evidence-based interventions for these diseases. One example that I have in mind is a very good surveillance system that was set in Kenya for a recent outbreak of Rift Valley fever. During that outbreak, which occurred recently in 2018, we were able to bring together people working in the wildlife sector to work with the veterinarians in the domestic livestock sector and the medics to really track cases which were spreading across board from livestock to humans. They were also able to develop good communication materials, which managed to stop some of the cases from exploding. Maybe to understand that better, previously when we didn't really have a good One Health approach, you could find different sectors giving conflicting information on what to do. So you could find, for example, the medical community asking people to pour milk because they were seen to be a source of infection. But the veterinarians were giving an alternative message saying you can boil milk and it will be safer if it's well boiled and well cooked. So one area in which I really see One Health working very well is this dissemination of risk-based communication from various sectors working together. One thing that we should also know is One Health is not always very effective. There are still many challenges of implementing One Health, especially in our region. One of that is up to now, the involvement of the climate or the environment sector is quite limited. Most of the One Health activities that are being done now are led by the medics, the veterinarians, and the environment side is not usually very strongly engaged. And this is a major loophole because we know, of course, many pandemics emerge from the wildlife sector. The last example I can give on how we still face challenges with One Health, it's funded from externally. We still need within country funding to make these things more sustainable, even when you don't have donor funding coming in place. So those are the few things I can mention for now. I think we'll be able to discuss this further with time.
Thank you so much, Bernard. It's really encouraging to hear that some action is already being taken on this front, and hopefully we can start learning from these early experiences as we improve further. At this point of time, I would like to remind our audience to please send us some questions to our experts. We have 206 participants at the moment online, so we have a good number of people. Please keep your questions coming. And then last but not least, we have Doreen Robinson to summarize a bit the discussion and also a bit of the policy options and recommendations. Doreen is a conservation ecologist serving as the Chief of Wildlife at Unep, based in Nairobi. She's a systems thinker driven by passion and a desire to connect people to find solutions to the world's most complex environmental and development challenges. She has worked on biodiversity, climate change, water, and human development on every continent except for the Antarctica. Doreen, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. And from that first Menti, I can see that there are some people out there who are up either really late or really early. So thank you for joining us. So I'm going to do a quick summary. we have heard a lot about what we know and what we don't know about zoonotic disease. And in particular, we know there's a lot more we have to learn about the integrated nature of human, animal, and environment linkages with the current disease, but also with zoonotic disease in general. Zoonoses are complex, Johannes pointed that out, and we need to unpack and embrace that complexity in our responses. It's also clear that we need to make some serious changes to understand and mitigate risks moving forward. So through this partnership with Unep and Ilri and many others, we hope to, we've produced a rapid assessment report and we've identified some key areas that I'll highlight now. Our first conclusion relates to the fact that human activity drives most of today's emerging zoonotic diseases. We identified 7 major factors, and we've talked about some of them already. First, unsustainable agricultural intensification and increasing demand for animal protein. Second, changes in food supply chains. Another cause, increased use and exploitation of wildlife. Intensified land use changes accompanied by habitat destruction and encroachment, which Johannes talked about. Unsustainable extractive industries, increased travel and transportation, and accelerated climate change. If we address these root causes, many of which are tied to protecting planetary health, we'll be improving our options for human well-being. The second set of findings from our report are tied to the main purpose of this whole conference, which is food security. Clearly, there are zoonotic risks associated with consumption and movement of wild and domesticated meat all along value chains, from the source to the market to your kitchen. Many have called for bans of so-called wet markets. These are traditional food markets where meat, wild or domesticated, is sold. Policy responses to address these risks must be measured, evidence-based, and appropriate to the risks at hand. Millions of people around the world depend on these markets to meet their food security and livelihood needs. With current limitations on human movement, interruptions in local and global food supply chains, and also just the general loss of jobs and income, we have to be careful that closing such markets would have serious negative impacts, particularly for the most vulnerable people. To be clear, the evidence indicates that these markets do pose risks for spreading zoonotic disease. That's true. However, the best responses should be based on a wider body of evidence related to the very complex social, economic, and epidemiological connections, and these responses have to be tailored to the specific risks. Improved sanitary measures and monitoring of these markets will undoubtedly help prevent zoonotic disease spread. The third point I want to make from the evidence that we gathered is that we need to do a much better job of understanding the risks associated with zoonotic disease, and that Bernard talked a bit about that. The current pandemic highlights how unprepared the world was in many ways. To increase our understanding and mitigate risk, we're calling for increased investment in multidisciplinary science. We've concluded there's a need to expand scientific inquiry into the very complex social, economic, and ecological dimensions of emerging zoonoses, and at the interface of environment, animal, and human health, which we keep repeating. We also need to improve cost-benefit analysis of emerging diseases to prevent cost-benefit analysis of emerging diseases for preventative interventions. This means we need to include full cost accounting of the societal impacts of disease, including the cost of unintended consequences of potential interventions, so we can optimize the results and reduce trade-offs. And my last point is that better risk assessment is only useful when it's tied to ensuring well-resourced preparedness and response mechanisms. When it comes to the risk of global pandemics, the weakest link matters. So these investments have to happen across the globe with coordinated support and learning. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Doreen. This was a very helpful summary, and we will continue discussing the policy implications and also the next steps that we need to take in the next part of this event. But now let's open the floor to questions from the audience. We have 206 participants joining this session at the moment, so yeah, we have a lot of people, and we already have some questions here. First one goes to Bernard. how do we overcome discipline barriers that are crucial to the One Health approach? For example, academia, in policymaking, and in research.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a big issue actually, and I should have mentioned it as one of the challenges we face in One Health, because it's a mix-up of many things, many professionals. So we have had that challenge before, and what we have done is working through time. It doesn't really happen immediately. When we develop strategies together over time, One Health starts as a felt need, so everybody will be interested to contribute their expertise in managing a given health problem. So I would say it's not an easy thing. It takes time to build, and also we develop strategies together over time with those various disciplines coming, putting their expertise on the table. So I really don't have a quick fix on that, but I just say it's something that has been realized in many places, but it takes time to overcome those challenges.
Thank you, Bernard. Yes, it's not an easy easy area to manage. The next question goes to Johannes. The One Health discussion has so far been dominated by meds and vets. Should ecologists have a stronger presence? Are there any steps in that direction?
Yeah, thank you, Paulina. Well, I'm a convinced ecologist, and I do believe that ecologists can contribute to a better understanding of the problem. And I think if we really want to respond to those challenges, we have to better understand the ecological processes underlying the emergence and spread of diseases. That means we need to understand the environmental conditions for pathogens, but we also have to understand the ecology of reservoirs and vectors. And to better understand, we need to really do much more monitoring in intact systems, as I indicated below, because that's when all ecological services are still intact. And then we have to look into systems which have been already disturbed or semi-disturbed and see what has changed, and is there any relationship between the change and the emergence spread of diseases. There are some projects right now looking into this, but we need much more, and it's just the beginning of a better understanding of these complex interrelationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. So I guess the short answer is yes, we need also the ecologist in this to curb this challenge. The next one goes for Delia. How are zoonotic diseases changing the perception of animals, which play a key role in maintaining ecological balance and maintain our crop systems and pollinate our crops? For example, bats are disease carriers, but also pollinators.
That's a really good question, and a pretty crucial point, because unfortunately these pandemics are very scary. And when people are afraid, one of their reactions is to try and remove what they think of as the cause. For example, there have been some cases of people trying to destroy bat colonies. And this has two things. One, bats are extremely essential for pollination, for insect management, for a whole range of ecological services. And secondly, when you start trying to cull large numbers of animals, you often end up just dispersing them, stressing them, and resulting in more disease. There are also a lot of myths around pandemics. Another, not just wild animals, but in many countries we've seen that people have wrongly thought that poultry could spread COVID-19 and have been culling or stopping eating poultry. And that, of course, can have very bad effects on the economy, but also on the nutritional status of people who are stunted, kids who are stunted and who are not getting enough meat. So there's a big need for awareness raising and for myth busting around pandemics and the importance of both wild and domestic animals.
Thank you, Delia. Very, very interesting. And if anybody else, anybody else from our expert panel wants to also chip in, please raise your hand. I have one final question for Doreen. I think we might have some time for a few additional questions, so please keep sending them in. So Doreen, what short and long-term steps must be taken, and by whom, to expand the One Health approach? Are there any examples of good practices?
Thanks. So in the short term, I think Bernard alluded to this. We need to start breaking down these silos across these different sectors, and the human, the animal, and the wild and the environment health people need to be talking together and working together as teams. I think we got a very good example from Bernard from Kenya. I think another place where we're seeing this work really well is in Uganda. And what I want to highlight from the Uganda example is that the One Health approach doesn't just happen at the national level. It has to flow down to the field and on the ground. And in Uganda, I know they work very closely with local health folks as well as folks in the environment community who are the eyes and ears on the ground, who have some training and background and can report back what is happening with zoonotic diseases. And that's flow of information across scales and having that multidisciplinarity at all those different scales is really critical for solving these problems. In the long term, I think a really important point we want to, maybe we're saying it over and over again, is we've got to expand the science and the evidence space. We can't have knee-jerk policy responses. And we want to unpack these complex linkages. We can't have the ecologists doing their own thing and the health folks doing their own thing and the wildlife vets doing their own thing, because as they do these things, their responses actually interact and affect the complex system of how these zoonotic diseases continue to, as they emerge, or how they're transmitted. So it's this interdisciplinarity of science that is, and a systems-based approach that are really needed in the long term. Thanks.
Great, that's a very comprehensive answer. I think we have a few minutes left, so there is one more question to Delia. Delia, you mentioned biosecurity in developing countries is difficult. How can governments be better supported or private sector to be incentivized to invest in this?
I think you have the answer in your question, and the answer is incentives. Too much in developing countries, we rely on rules and regulations. So, for example, telling smallholders that they have to do 20 different things like keep records and have foot baths and isolate their animals, and things which really, one, it's not practical for them to do, and two, they do it, it costs them money to do it, and they don't see a reward. So if we want farmers and value chain actors to produce safer food and keep animals in better ways, there have to be incentives in place to make them change their behavior. And those incentives can be subsidies, can be training, can be extension officers, can be bringing attention to good practices and attention to bad practices. But as we tend to do now, which is just rely on rules and regulations, that doesn't work. In fact, it can be counterproductive, because if a farmer gets penalized when he reports a new disease, when his farm gets closed down, when his animals are killed, but maybe he doesn't get any compensation, then instead of having an incentive to report disease, he has an incentive to hide it. So it's all about getting the right incentives in place. Over.
Thank you, Delia. We have one more final question, and that goes to Johannes. As someone who has worked very closely with specific species like apes, how is the concept of sentience of animals included in the One Health concept?
Sorry, I was slow in unmuting. A complex question. I mean, there are many aspects included in the One Health approach. And it does include also the animal welfare. And I think that, I mean, obviously, great apes are very close to us, to humans. We care a lot for them. So this obviously should be covered in a One Health approach, that we show respect for animals. And I believe it should go beyond just great apes. I mean, we talk about domestic animals, wild animals, the use of domestic animals, the use of wild animals. I think that respect for animals has to come really prominently out in that approach. I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question completely, but that's a little bit my view on it, that we should show respect for animals. And obviously, when animals are closer to us as the great apes, we show more care. But this is an important element which should be incorporated in a One Health approach.
Thank you, Johannes. If we have 1 minute left, and if Bernard is very quickly answering this question, maybe we can include this one as well. How One Health approach applied for farmer who live together with animals as their economic resource. So how is One Health approach applied for farmer who live together with animals as their economic resource? Just 1 minute, Bernard.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So some of the diseases, which farmers encounter also have impacts on productivity. So One Health approach in that sense would really, and most of these diseases also are climate, environment related. So if for example, you're working in areas where there's interaction between wildlife and livestock, it actually can, such a farmer can work, or people within that community can work with maybe wildlife authorities to manage interactions between their livestock and wildlife. But if you're thinking also of a zoonotic disease which a farmer can get, then such a farmer can get information from a medical community on how to limit exposure to those zoonotic diseases, maybe by treating their milk, boiling it properly so that they also prevent exposure. So there are lots of things they can do with various.
Thank you, Bernard, for that advice. All right, we have come to the end of our expert panel now. Before we move to the second part of our event, we have another Menti question to our audience. So based on what you've heard from our experts now, what is your one takeaway from these presentations? Just one key message you will remember from this session. And perhaps while you are writing down your answers and sending them over, I can introduce Mr. Michael Victor, who is the Head of Communications and Knowledge Management at Ilri. He will be moderating the policy level discussion now. Michael is a rural development specialist with 20 years of experience focusing on communications, knowledge management, capacity building, and project design in the agricultural and natural resources management sector.
Excellent. Thank you, Paulina. Great job. Really interesting stuff. Let's see what we get up here in terms of what were some of the main takeaways as we go through. I had a couple, so it'll be interesting to see if if they match to what people are coming up with as well. I see here the complexity of implementing a One Health approach, how important, but also how important it is. Collaboration, very important. One Health is a systematic cross-sectoral approach, looking at the community level too. I think Doreen really mentioned that. Power relations remain hidden. Maybe that's something very interesting. Multidisciplinarity. The need for research, camaraderie, complex interactions. Very interesting. Yeah, and for the speakers, intensive agriculture is part of the problem. How do we solve that? Communication between ecologists, health scientists, community are very important. Excellent. Some really good questions here. So I think we're going to start with the panel discussion right now. I mean, there are 4 things that really came up for me that are part of this as well that people are taking from their takeaways. And I think one is really this trade-offs between industrial agriculture, livestock, the environment, and health. How do we balance all these? A lot of incentives. How do we create incentives to actually scale out the One Health approach? How do you finance the One Health approach? How do we do better risk assessment, which came out a lot? And then how to improve collaboration, particularly in the world today when all the countries seem to be going in amongst themselves. How do we get that cross-sectoral analysis? How do we get countries working together? How do we create again, a global movement to deal with this problem. So I hope these are some of the issues that we really want to tackle in this policy presentation, in this policy panel. And we're really honored to have a really diverse panel here, which I think demonstrates the need to work across sectors. Today we have a representative from Ilri, from the UN Environment Program and the Ministry of Health of Kenya. And as Pauline mentioned earlier, I think there's a real partnership emerging, particularly here within Kenya, between Ilri, the UN Environment Program, and the Ministry of Health, you know, really looking at how we kind of implement it from all sides. And then globally, I think Ilri and the UN are also looking at a wider collaboration as well. So let me, before we start, just introduce the panel very quickly. And if I could ask the panelists to turn on their video as well. Our first panelist is Dr. Hadley Matendachiro Sutoni, who is a consultant psychiatrist pharmacist with a master's degree in clinical pharmacy from the University of Nairobi. He currently serves as the head of division for the vector-borne and neglected tropical diseases in Kenya at the Ministry of Health. And it's very interesting, he's not just doing this in his day job, but he's passionately involved with the Kenya Red Cross Society, where he plays a key role there. And let's open up his video. Can you put on your video, Hadley? Dr. Sultani? Yeah, there we go, great. We also have Dr. Susan Gardner, who is the director of the Ecosystems Division of the UN Environment Program. She holds a PhD in fisheries and has over 2 decades of experience in science and environmental policy, and uniquely really working for the Mexican and the United States government. She has a dual nationality for both and has worked on a range of policies and strategies in regards to the environment. She's also worked on a number of multilateral agreements, such as the Strategic Approach to International Chemical Management, the Global Muckery Partnership, and the Stockholm Convention. We were talking earlier, and she also mentioned that as a scientist, when she was studying in Mexico marine ecology, she started looking at how contaminants move through coastal ecosystems, and she really saw that in her research on sea turtles, which travel from Japan to Mexico and back. And she started to really see the interconnectivity. So diseases could travel from very far just from animals, not just because of humans as well. So it's very interesting. I think that's something that we'll have to talk about, is this interconnectivity. And then finally, we have Dr. Ian Wright, who is working at the International Livestock Research Institute. He's the Deputy Director General of Research and Development of Integrated Sciences. Previously, he was a program leader for the Animal Science for Sustainable Productivity. And from 2006 to 2012, he was Ilri's regional rep in Asia, based in Delhi. And during that time, he served on the advisory committee of a program called the Roadmap to Combat Zoonotic Diseases, managed by the Public Health Foundation of India. So he's had some long time experience working on this kind of One Health approach. So again, for this session, we'll just do a couple of rounds of discussion of questions, and we do want questions from the audience. So please do send us your questions, and we'll pose those to the expert panel. So in the first round, really, we just want to get, what's your impression of the presenters? Can you give us in 90 seconds just what are some of your key takeaways, and what are some of the issues that we really need to work on? I'd like to ask Dr. Hadley first for his comments. Please unmute, Dr. Sultani, please unmute.
Thank you very much. I think I've gotten to unmute. So in my opinion, the presenters have done a very good job. I think lots of interesting information over there around the One Health approach. They have adequately addressed the issue around collaboration, being an approach that looks at the interaction between the animal, human environment interface. Then, of course, we really have very many stakeholders who have to come in so that they can contribute towards the objective. So one of the things that came out very clearly is that we need a platform that allows for this kind of interaction, which is very well coordinated. And at policy level, one of the main emphasis that we place is to be able to provide this kind of platform where all the important stakeholders can be able to comfortably contribute. At the Ministry of Health, we have a division which is dedicated to management of zoonotic diseases, which is actually run together with the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock, and Fisheries. And this platform allows for all stakeholders to come together. And there has been established, structures within this platform where we have steering committees, technical working groups. Somebody asked about, issues around discipline, a kind of like academia, research. How do the barriers come out? I think this platform provides for that. So it is something that came out quite well, and also in terms of the interventions that we want to carry out, this also was brought out quite adequately. So it was a very rich discussion, and I think quite informative as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sultani. And we'll circle back to the One Health issue later on when we talk to you about that. Susan, do you want to give some of your quick impressions and thoughts on the presentations?
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's very difficult to boil it down to one impression. Excellent presentations that Dr. Sultani's already mentioned. I think the two things that I really walked away with from those presentations is that human activities are the drivers of zoonotic disease. So it was clear that it's the things that we do either through degrading the environment or through intensive agriculture or wildlife consumption that's not monitored or not regulated that brings us into proximity with the animals. And so that, to me, that in together with the other message in terms of how important it is that we're sharing information across the different forms of health research and health work on animals, on humans, on the environment, so that we can better understand the various drivers that are all contributing to increasing risks of the future pandemic. Phenomenal presentations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Ian, maybe some of your final comments. It was good to see that we had research come up more and more, that we need more research. But any thoughts from you on some of the
Sure. Thanks, Michael. I mean, I think the first thing that struck me is that, you know, we're trying to deal with some very complex issues, as the speakers brought out, trying to deal with some very complex interactions across human health, environmental health, and animal health. But I think the speakers gave us some simple frameworks that help us navigate that complexity, because when you're dealing with complex problems, you have to break them down in such a way that they become manageable. I was really impressed by the way that all the speakers kind of helped us do that, help us navigate that complexity. So I think they laid out for us a kind of way of thinking that helped us to navigate that complexity. And the second thing, which was mentioned a couple of times, was I think we need to be able to build the relationship, particularly with the environmental health community. As someone pointed out, One Health historically has tended to be dominated by the medics and the vets. And it's great to see a greater involvement of the environmental and ecological community. And you know, the growing relationship between Ilri and Unep and this forthcoming report and so on is an example of that. So I'm very pleased to see that deepening relationship. It's really important.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that. Ian, I'd like to, kind of stick with you right now, and we'll just go around. So in the second round, kind of just some more specific questions. Actually, I'm going to throw this one at you. You know, I was kind of struck by Delia's comment that I think it was 60%, she said, of the kind of weight of animals in the, on planet Earth that come from livestock, a really inordinate amount. And so what do we do? We talked about some of the answers, or some of the is the answer to get rid of livestock in the developing world? What do we, how do we deal with this? What are some of the trade-offs between livestock, health, and the environment? Is it to get rid of it? What are some ways to move forward on this?
So as Delia and others pointed out, animals, both wildlife and domestic animals, are key components of this complexity and transmission of disease from wildlife through livestock to humans, or in many cases direct from livestock. We tend to think of the kind of large pandemic diseases being transmitted to humans, but there are many, many other diseases that are zoonotic, things like brucellosis, tuberculosis, and so on. And at first sight, you might think, well, the livestock are the bad guys. Let's get rid of them and prevent these zoonotic diseases. But the reality is that, as you point out, Michael, there are significant and very important trade-offs to be considered. 2 billion people on this planet, 1 in 5 of us, depend on livestock to some extent for our livelihoods. They're critically important for nutrition, particularly in low and middle income countries, and particularly for vulnerable groups during the first 1,000 days of life, for women of childbearing age and so on. And in many cases, we have many, many millions of people who would benefit from consuming more animal products, not less. Of course, we have many people in the world who would benefit from consuming less as well. So embedded in the One Health approach, we do need to look at these trade-offs. We do need cost-benefit analysis to how do we deal with these challenges while at the same time maximizing the positive benefits of livestock in terms of economic growth, employment, and human nutrition. And we're making some progress on that. So there was mention during the discussion earlier of the need to include not just the biophysical sciences, medicine, veterinary science, ecology, and so on, but the need to include social sciences in One Health, looking at economics, looking at cost-benefit analysis, looking at gender dimensions, because often we find that in many cases, women may be disproportionately disadvantaged through the burden of disease. So we need to look at both the positive and the negative impacts and influences of livestock, and use social sciences, use economics. And another critically important area, as we've seen in the COVID-19 response, we need to understand people's behavior and psychology. Because if we're going to change people's behavior and provide incentives, we need to understand how we'll respond. We're beginning to see how people respond to imposition of lockdowns and so on. So we need to understand those psychological and behavioral effects. So what I'm saying is this multidisciplinarity in One Health needs to go beyond just medicine and ecology and veterinary sciences. We need the social sciences in there as well.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and Susan, just to kind of get back to you, and yeah, looking at some of this, this coordination roles, particularly, what do you see as some of the priority environment and ecosystem-based recommendations? And, what is the role for global frameworks and policies? How can we really create a global approach? They say One Health is a cross-sectoral approach, but how do we create that globalism needed to, really kind of address the pandemic? And how does that then flow down to different levels? And as Doreen even mentioned, going down to the community level. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real risk right now that as governments seek to bring their economies back and to respond to the immediate issues around population health, that there could be backsliding on some of the environmental achievements that we've so far been able to advance through implementing various multilateral environmental agreements. And so it's really essential that we continue to raise awareness about how important those environmental actions are as part of protecting human health, but also as part of sustainable economies, that green economies and green investments is the long-term way to ensure that you have successful prosperity, you can relieve poverty, and you can also at the same time be protecting public health against future pandemics. So making those connections, particularly right now while the media has so much focus on beginning to raise awareness and understanding about the linkages between zoonotic diseases and environment. Truly, we have the roadmaps already for what we need to do and where we need to go. The 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, that tells us the targets we need to meet, and we're behind on so many of them. The Paris Agreement is clear about the kinds of actions that are required. And what we need to do is really focus now. In 2020, with the lockdowns and travel restrictions, it has slowed down our progress that we thought we were going to make with these conventions this year. But it has given us more time to invest in ensuring that we have the actions and the momentum to further ambition on these. And I would just echo again what others have said in terms of investing right now to ensure that stimulus packages are invested wisely. I love Dalia's comments about ensuring that we have the incentives right, because that's the risk right now, is that stimulus packages could, if getting the incentives wrong, move us backwards and actually have long-term detrimental effects, not only for the environment, for future public health. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sultani, yeah, you know, kind of building upon your ideas of the One Health approach, kind of looking at that at the national level. I have actually one question that came in from the audience, which I think is just great. So I think we'll jump to that as well. So I'd like to ask you, you know, or someone from the audience would like to, what keeps you awake at night when it comes to the pandemic? And how do you deal with that with a One Health approach? So I'd like you to ask you that. And then I was also interested in, you've said it's actually institutionalized within Kenya as well. How is that financed? We heard from Bernard and others that the financing is sometimes a constraint. So how is that financed? And are there other constraints that you see in the One Health approach? But yeah, that is great. What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so right now, I think one of the biggest concerns that we are having is that a lot of the health programs that we have been running have kind of ground to a halt. And we are now rolling back on the gains that we had made. And when you look at some of the activities that we have been running, like trying to bring rabies under control, you know, through mass vaccinations and things like that, now we are unable to proceed. And some of these mass kind of interventions, we cannot conduct them in a COVID-19 kind of scenario. So the big question we are now asking ourselves is, how do we get back to, you know, implementing some of these interventions, even as we are faced with this pandemic right now? And I think that's where we are putting a lot of our focus. We are inviting our researchers to come in and give us scientific projections on how we can either restart. And then, of course, we are also aware that it is very likely that this pandemic is not going to go away. COVID-19 is not going away very soon. We are hoping that, yes, indeed, we might be able to stop transmission, but then we might have COVID-19 within us for some time. So generally, that is one big question that as public health managers, we are looking at, especially when we look at some of these conditions, like the ones that need a One Health approach to be able to handle. Now, back to the other issue that you raised. In terms of resource mobilization, we are aware that quite a good amount of resources is required to be able to implement some of these interventions that we are looking at for One Health. But we are also aware that even though these resources are scarce, but whatever little resource we get, we need to spread it out so that we are able to, you know, spread out the last shilling to give us as much value as possible. And in our strategic priorities, one of the most important out of the 4 strategic priorities we have as a country program, we are looking at resource mobilization, but then we are also looking at financial sustainability. So we are looking at being able to mobilize resources from external sources, from funding partners. We are able to look at how do we optimize deployment of these resources by properly deploying implementation partnerships. But then at the same time, we are also trying to see how does the government chip in through the various departments so that we can also contribute towards sustainable financing of these interventions that we want to implement. So it's one of the key strategic priorities that we are looking at as a Ministry of Health.
Excellent. Oh, very interesting. Okay, and we'll come back to that, I think, as well. Just looking at some of the questions from the floor, Susan, this one's to you. How do we increase government's awareness and responses, as well as building health policy to tackle the impact of climate change on human health? Because some countries still neglect this issue.
Really important question, and it's essential. I think there's two things that are really important. One is to ensure that working with governments ways that resonates with their needs and with the kinds of decisions that they are currently making. Taking conversations out of just the vocabulary that an environment minister will understand, but that making policy decisions relevant to finance ministers and those who are planning urban development, those who are making decisions about the economic development of their countries. So ensuring that we have practical solutions that are presented in ways that resonate and that are useful to a cross-sector of government officials who are in positions to make these decisions and to address priorities. The second is through educating our youth. And we're seeing right now 1 billion kids out of school. This is a perfect opportunity to really rethink curricula. And we know that, the future, we know that. So if we have developed a program called Earth School that's reached more than 1 million people, where we provide virtual platforms with environmental curricula that needs to be incorporated across all topics, so that the next generation is environmentally literate and they understand the importance of these things and they don't become just sort of niche specialization kinds of topics with vocabulary that people aren't able to engage in. Those would be the two major things I think that have to happen.
You're on mute, Michael.
Sorry, Mark, I think you're muted.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks a lot. That was good. And I got a barrage of people saying that I'm still on mute. Thank you. Excellent. So the question is, Ian, what opportunities for One Health have you seen in this particular pandemic that were not there in previous pandemics?
I think that for those of us who've been working and promoting the One Health idea for many more years than we care to remember sometimes, one thing I do see emerging is a realization that of the many things we've been discussing, that the COVID-19 pandemic is not just an issue of public health or animal health or environment health. I think the penny is beginning to drop amongst many people, that those three things are interconnected. And while obviously the immediate focus is on public health and how do we balance public health with opening up economies and so on, increasingly we're seeing governments thinking about, but how do we move forward from here? So that there are discussions going on, and Ilri and my colleagues and I are involved in some of them with governments and other agencies about the fact that, as I say, the penny is beginning to drop, that maybe the One Health approach is something that we need to consider much more seriously going forward. Now it's early days yet. Those discussions are just beginning to emerge as governments and others think about the future. So I think there is an opportunity, if we can be, if I can talk from a research perspective, from the research community, I think there's an opportunity to begin to do more of many of the things that our panelists were talking about earlier, Delia and Bernard and Johannes and so on, and Doreen. And we need to be able to respond to, the questions that governments and others and agencies and organizations are beginning to ask of us. Clearly, we don't have all the answers, but we do have some of the thinking that can help drive things forward. So I do see a debate beginning to emerge where One Health ideas and concepts are beginning to become much more prominent in terms of forward thinking, including in political dialogue. And I don't think we saw that to the same extent as we have seen we haven't seen that to the same extent in other pandemics. I do see it emerging in this pandemic. So maybe there's an opportunity here to move forward and embrace some of the thinking that we've been discussing for the last hour and a half.
Okay, I have two more questions for our panelists here, and then we've gotten some previous questions for some of the previous panelists, so I'll bring them in. I have a question just for Dr. Sultani, because we were talking a lot about cross collaboration. I'm just wondering, can you give us examples? Are you working in the Horn of Africa or, you know, with other neighbors about the One Health approach? How do you share approaches? You know, we talked about it's very strong in Kenya, but lagging a bit behind in Uganda or other places. How are you working as a region to really tackle this issue? You have to unmute yourself.
I keep on forgetting to unmute. So yeah,
I did it too.
Yeah, this is one of, as I said before, this is one of our key priorities, strategic priorities. We are trying to look at, you know, building collaborations across borders, and we are not just looking at it in terms of country borders. We are also looking even internally as a country. We have started off by looking at what is the pattern, the endemicity pattern of some of these diseases. So within the country, we have counties, which are regions. So we try to ensure that our interventions are harmonized across regions so that we don't have, you know, some of the regions, interventions not being carried out and then interfering with the regions where interventions have been carried out because of our migratory patterns. But even when we now get out of the country, like for example, when we consider our neighboring countries, to the south, there's Tanzania. We have a community that's the Maasai community, which actually lives across the border. When we move towards the western side, Uganda on the western side, and it becomes even more complicated because we have South Sudan, there's the Ateke region where communities actually don't recognize the borders. So the cross-border collaboration is something that we have taken very seriously. And we have a very strong regional approach because it will defeat the purpose if we try to put in a very robust implementation or a control mechanism across the border in Kenya, and then we don't take consideration of what is happening on the other side of the border. So we are utilizing the regional bodies to be able to advance the One Health agenda as much as possible so that we can move together and achieve a regional objective in terms of control of these diseases.
Excellent, thank you. For Susan, just really quickly, you know, we've heard a lot about Asia and Africa, but we haven't heard much about Latin America, and actually the pandemic's booming there right now, from what I've at least understood. What are some of your thoughts on how do you support the One Health approach in Latin America?
Well, I think in some ways the approach is going to be similar. One thing that we're looking to do from Unep is to ensure that we have good information across all different regions and as specific as possible in terms of the really targeted needs of individual countries or subregions. So as we begin to have a good scientific basis, like this zoonosis report is providing for us, we can connect it to policy options. And those policy options then can be tailored to the needs of the countries. But it has to be demand driven. It has to be in places where the countries are prepared and ready to have these conversations and to need this information. So looking at the kinds of where they are in terms of their recovery plans and how we can help to inform about options for how to invest in green solutions that actually help to benefit the long-term protection against pandemics, and simultaneously you'll get benefits for biodiversity and climate change, which will be back on the radar eventually as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susan. We have a couple questions for the other panelists, so I'd ask them to quickly turn on their cameras as well. Maybe for Delia and quickly for Doreen, we had someone, you know, and again, the real theme of this session is really our food systems are broken. Are our food systems broken? What are some of the lessons emerging from this pandemic to help us reshape how we produce, consume, and protect our food?
Yes, but I would just like to add to what Susan said about Latin America. Before there was One Health, there was EcoHealth, which was started in the 80s and 90s in the Amazon basin, looking at some of the environmental impacts of mining. And over the years, EcoHealth and One Health have converged in many ways. So I would just say that South America has got one of the longest histories of these integrative, multidisciplinary environment health approaches, a lot to build on. I think our food systems are extremely good at getting food. We've had more people on the planet now than ever has been, and the population is set to grow. And if it hadn't been for the food systems, we would already be facing starvation, more hunger than there is today. So food systems are doing a good job in getting food, but they're doing a bad job in managing what people sometimes call the externalities of food production. That is the unwanted consequences. And that's not just disease. We're talking about emerging disease, but there's also the disease which is every day present in our food, the E. coli, the Campylobacter, the Salmonella. And then there is the problems of non-communicable disease, of obesity and cardiovascular and diabetes, also associated with the food we eat and the food systems. And that's not to mention issues like animal welfare. We talked about sentience and values, the way we treat animals. And of course, the environment, that this is basically, our food systems are unsustainable. And unless we do things different, we may all end up having enough to eat and even to make ourselves very fat, but we may not have a planet left on which to continue doing this.
Doreen, do you want to add on to that? I saw you.
Yeah, good
finger.
catch.
Yeah.
Just two other points. I completely agree with Delia, but I think one thing we haven't talked a lot about, which is also pollution. And in the way we actually grow some of our pollute using harmful chemicals, polluting water systems, that actually has an impact on the ability of people to not only respond and recover from zoonotic diseases, but also in terms of they're already vulnerable and burdened. And so they are more likely with suppressed immune systems to actually have those initial responses to when they're exposed to zoonotic diseases. So we have to think about that in our food systems. And then the other is that this current crisis has shown, food systems have been impacted locally, regionally, globally, in terms of just the movement of food. A lot of people often don't know where they get their food from in the global system. In local systems, it's very clear where it comes from. And so we have to look at the whole value chain in these food systems and really start to think, if your food comes from somewhere and it is leading to deforestation in Latin America, Africa, Asia, wherever, what is that actually saying for zoonotic disease emergence in those particular places? So I personally, and I think Unep thinks we need a massive rethink of food systems globally to get at these issues in a better way.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Just one final question to some of the panelists, and then we'll go back to the policy experts. There has been a question about, we see everybody, from particularly the presenters coming from their specific disciplines. How do you go across disciplines? And do you have some examples of your stories of change of how you actually did this cross-sectoral work? Johannes, you said you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. We're very happy to provide an example. So many years back, when I did my research in the Thai forest in Ivory Coast, obviously one of these excellent places to study primates, but also one of the places where we obviously have a lot of diseases, Ebola associated with West Africa. There was an Ebola outbreak many years back in Cote d'Ivoire, but at a small scale. SIV, HIVs, I mean, we obviously know that HIV has become a pandemic, and it stems from immunodeficiency viruses in monkeys. The first form, HIV-1 from manga bees, which is a monkey in West Africa, HIV-2 and HIV-1 from chimpanzees. And at the time, I was leading a research consortium consisting of veterinary doctors, medical scientists, ecologists, behavioral ecologists to understand better the whole issue around SIVs, HIVs, and we were afraid that maybe one day we might see an HIV-3 crisis in the world. But one of the issues was that I was leading it. I know I'm not a medical doctor. So some of the big funding organizations, especially in the US, they was asking me, "Oh, Johannes is a good guy, but he has the wrong background to get the millions." But I still believe that our approach was very important at the time, because obviously chimpanzees, they feed on smaller monkeys, so they can basically contract diseases from them when feeding on them. But also when we hunt primates, we also can contract them. And one of the real big research questions right now is, what made the chimpanzee version of immunodeficiency viruses more capable of infecting humans? Is it because chimpanzees are more closer to us? What are the implications? And we also were arguing, well, we're changing our environment. There's more forest fragmentation. So animals come out of the forest. There's more interaction between humans and primates. Humans eat primates in many cases. So by studying primate behavior and primate ecology, it's just helping us to understand the whole mosaic of the question much better. So that's my example. And I think the questions we raised 15 years ago are still very important right now. And we need the ecologist in that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think just one final thing, and maybe Bernard has some ideas on this, since he's heading up the One Health Center, the new One Health Center for Africa. Looking back, is someone asked, is in fact One Health really new, and what do indigenous communities really have to offer here, because maybe they've been practicing that all along. And do you see some of this kind of One Health that's actually part of some of the indigenous knowledge systems that are getting left behind, and how do we incorporate those back into a wider approach?
No, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question, and it's often raised in many places. It's actually an old concept which has developed over time. Since I saw some publications talking of the 17th century, when there was the first development of medicine. So it has gone. Initially, we used to call it one medicine, where you just had to have veterinary and medical issues being handled together. It has developed over time. Environment has come into place. So this is an old concept, and even our forefathers, I think, used to know how to manage diseases because even if you go to pastoral communities, actually some of them use livestock products to manage human cases, which is not really recommended, but they have a concept that you can deal with those diseases at that level. Maybe to deviate a bit from your question I had, maybe do you have time just for one example or?
Sure, go ahead, very quick.
Yeah, so when you're asking about a practical example, recently what we have realized in the pastoral communities, the medical community, one of the treatments people get in hospitals are mainly zoonotic diseases, and they go back home without any advice on how to go and manage their environments within their homesteads. And so what we have done currently is to engage the veterinarians to, whenever somebody comes down with a disease like brucellosis, which it's from cattle, we engage them to go and contact a veterinarian who would then go and screen the cattle he or she is milking for home consumption. So in that case, you eliminate an animal that is really helping to propagate the infection. So it's working very well in some places, because you give incentives to people to not only get medication at the dispensary, but also to go back home and realize that to stop further exposure and protect some of my family members, I need to call a veterinarian to come and screen animals which I'm getting milk from. So which is really a very strong way of seeing One Health in action.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so I'd like to finish up with our policy panel, the final three. Just really kind of, can you sum up for us really what you think needs to happen to prevent the next pandemic, and how do we ensure it happens, from your level and your perspective? Just a quick takeaway. What can we do next about all this? We've heard some great things, but what do you take away, and what can we really do next to prevent this happening again, or this so badly happening again? Ian, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think that many people have been saying that, it wasn't a question of if the next pandemic's going to come along, it's a question of when. So it's clear that we don't have the systems in place to be able to do the surveillance, to bring together surveillance in animals, surveillance in the human population. So it seems to me that we really need to be investing in much more comprehensive surveillance systems across the human population, across the livestock population, and in wildlife in the environment. So have developed those connected surveillance systems and put in place the response mechanisms that where we can detect these things earlier rather than get to the stage where it becomes a pandemic. And at the moment, those surveillance systems across the veterinary community and the medical community and across wildlife are really not well, they don't function very well. They're disconnected. So we need to, for me, I think the critical thing is to begin to develop much more comprehensive surveillance systems so that we can detect things at a much earlier stage than we're capable of doing at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Sultani, what are your final recommendations and thoughts for action? You need to unmute again. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me all the time. So I can just quickly maybe put them into 4 major areas. Number 1, I want to agree with Ian that we have to invest in very strong monitoring, evaluation, surveillance and research systems so that we can be able to pick up any kinds of trends that can degenerate into a pandemic. Number 2, we also have to fortify our interventions so that we give a comprehensive package. I think we have already made good advances in terms of making these interventions available, but we have to keep these diseases down so that we don't get to a critical level where we start seeing issues arising which can lead to pandemics. And then the third point is around resources. Of course, we are really struggling with resource mobilization, but we have to come up with innovative ways in which not only we are able to mobilize these resources, but we are able to optimally deploy them. And we also have to develop very robust plans that are costed, which can ensure that we are utilizing these resources as well as possible. And then finally, we really need to work on our coordination in terms of the partnerships that we have so that we can build capacity, especially within governments, because these partnerships, this process has to be government owned. So we need to build very strong and useful partnerships across board that can be able to deliver the control interventions as best as possible. Thank you.
Excellent. I really like those 4 areas. Susan, what are your final thoughts and actions that we need to take?
Well, certainly my colleagues have presented already very good points. What I would add to the conversation is we need changes in behavior. We've seen through this period of COVID response that public behavioral changes are possible on an enormous scale that would have been hard to imagine. To see these kinds of global behavioral changes. And we also heard earlier today in the first panel that human activities are the cause of zoonotic disease. So that's promising, that's hopeful. That means that we can change our behaviors in order to actually affect the future of pandemics. Once the dust settles and we have gotten through this particular crisis and have begun recovery, the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are still going to be there for us to address. And we know that these are the same drivers of future pandemics, of zoonotic diseases. We also know that you can't achieve progress on either biodiversity or climate without changing food systems. So I would advocate for next steps being to make sure that consumers are aware of the importance of their choices. Make sure they have the information that they need, evidence-based information to help make good decisions to help understand the impacts of your daily choices all across the world. That there's science-based information and there's good education at all levels, so that we can see behavior continue to happen in the right directions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. That's really good. And it's great that you got the behavior change. I think this is our opportunity. In a time of crisis, we have a real opportunity to change things. We have 1 minute left, and I'm going to move to the Menti again. And I'll also start to hand it over to Pauline. I'd like to thank the policy panel. It was really good. I think you really summed up some of the key issues and the ways forward. We have 3 minutes left. Okay, great. Thanks, Kamal. And so, yeah, we have one more Menti question just to get everybody thinking together. You know, what is the one thing, what is one new thing that you learned from this session? So overall, what did you learn from this session? What did you take away? What do you think we need to do? It'd be good to hear from you. And just for a couple of minutes, and I'll hand it over to Pauline to help close us off. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, we're approaching the end of our session. I'd like to warmly thank all of our speakers. I think this has been a very fruitful discussion. And many thanks to our active audience as well. You have raised some really, really nice questions. I think there's a lot of information to digest from this session, but at the same time, a lot of information and knowledge still needs to be discovered and developed. I think my key takeaway would be that, like with many other complex challenges that we're facing with sustainable development, we need a holistic approach with disease management as well. Michael, do you want to add anything, or should we just close?
For me, yeah, I think we can close. We'll just wait for a couple more minutes to
Sure.
see if there's any other interesting things here. I think what came up, and again, it's kind of like what Susan had mentioned in the end, the youth, you know, the future. People are now, you know, it's not just about what, you know, my kids even, not just learn what they're learning in the classroom, but there's a lot of life learning now, and there's opportunities for this behavior change. And it's, you know, those are the youth are the real future and taking action. So giving them the space to do that, I think. And we see some interesting stuff coming up here. We could just spend maybe 1 more minute, and then holistic approach, cross-sectoralism.
There's the weakest link.
Yeah.
Responses are never better than the weakest link.
Yeah, that was a good one. Interesting. Awareness about food sources and value chains. Yeah, that was a great point, Susan, about, you know, again, maybe more of this, the pull from the consumers as well. This is excellent. Yeah, very good. That's it. I think, Susan, do you want to call it to the, Pauline, do you want to call it to the end? And I think we can close it now.
I think it's time to close now and let the next speakers start.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone again, and goodbye for now.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.